All right. And with that, we're live and the embargo is officially lifted. Hey, everyone. I'm David Culver. I am not in Shanghai, despite my backdrop, but I am still with CNN. I actually had this backdrop with me, by the way, when I lived 3 years in China from 2019 to 2022, which, if you recall those time periods, it was an interesting one, starting with what we covered in Wuhan and then what ended up being a lockdown in Shanghai for me for 50 days sealed inside of my apartment. So this backdrop is really near and dear to my heart because it spent a lot of time with me. But it's also really topical for our discussion today. And it's one that's getting already a lot of media attention. And you see on the screen with me, we've got Brad Parks. He's the executive director of AidData, and Sailor Miao. He's a AidData researcher. And what they have put together has taken a lot of time, a lot of work, well beyond them. I think another 139 people, 140 people beyond them. They had 142 folks working on this over the course of 3 years, and it's now making a lot of headlines. And I'll read some of those headlines to start us off, guys, and then we can chat a little bit about what's behind this research and how you made it come to fruition. So, The Economist will start with what they've put out. They say China's financial tentacles run deeper through America than previously thought. Their subline on this, as well as relying more on the Chinese state for credit, rich countries are emulating its style of lending, writes Bradley Parks. They use your full name there, Bradley, so you know it's serious. The New York Times saying, we now have a better picture of China's global lending spree. And CNN, in China's global lending spree, the US has been the biggest beneficiary, study finds. That study, those behind it, Brad and Sailor. So thank you both for all the work you put into this. First of all, I mean, I know AidData has been around since 2004, and essentially you can describe it better than me, but it does a lot of the international development research. It's a lab that allows for this. First of all, Brad, what's the big takeaway for you as you've been making the media rounds? And I know at least a dozen major publications have already been putting your name and work out there, but what stands out?
A couple of things. I guess three big takeaways. First is that Beijing's overseas lending portfolio is now worth about $2.1 trillion, which is much, much larger than anyone previously understood. The second thing is that there are surprisingly few places in the world where Chinese lending operations are not taking place. So there's 179 countries that are borrowing money from Chinese state-owned creditors. And then the third big one is that lending for Belt and Road infrastructure projects in the developing world accounts for a surprisingly small share of the overall lending portfolio, just 20%. We thought, many others thought that was the main focus of China's overseas lending. And pretty much everyone assumed that China's lending operations in wealthy industrialized countries were small and insignificant. And what we discovered was the opposite to be true. So the share of their overseas lending portfolio that supports high income countries and upper middle income countries, it has just skyrocketed from 12% all the way up to 76%. I was stunned. I think Sailor was probably stunned as well to learn that Beijing has bankrolled roughly 10,000 projects and activities in high income countries
Yeah.
to the tune of nearly $1 trillion. And I mean, the irony here is very rich, right? Because Washington and its allies, they've spent the better part of the last decade warning other countries about the dangers of accumulating significant debt exposure to China. They've sort of said Beijing is a predatory lender and it ensnares and subordinates foreign borrowers by plying them with easy access to credit and then, sort of negotiating contractual terms and conditions that will require that they surrender physical assets like a seaport or an airport in the event of default. And yet, the G7 countries, the OECD countries, what are they doing? They're allowing, Chinese state-owned creditors to finance critical infrastructure within their own jurisdictions. They're funding power plants in the UK and data centers in Northern Virginia and oil and gas terminals in Canada and seaports in Israel and Greece and the United Arab Emirates. So, these were really major discoveries and surprises for our team.
This is, I mean, it was shocking for me reading through some of this. I mean, somebody who reported for many years on where Chinese investment was, what its focus was with that money and funding, and then to look at, and I know, Sailor, you're behind a lot of the charts and graphs, but, and you can see, by the way, there's a link there with the full report so folks can look along with us if they want to dig deeper. But to see, I mean, the United States, top of the list there as far as what it's receiving from these Chinese investments. How do you track that? How are you able to do this? I know it takes time. Obviously, transparency isn't, you know, a strong note for Beijing, but how are you able to follow the money?
Yeah, well, I mean, China does not make it very easy for us. Their overseas lending portfolio is shrouded in secrecy. It is officially considered to be a state secret. But here's the interesting thing. There is this vast treasure trove of information about Chinese loans that's in the public domain, and that's because borrowers are there's two parties to each one of these transactions, right? So borrowers are free to publish information about their debts to China, and they often do. So the challenge that we faced is that the information that is disclosed by Beijing's borrowers, it's not that it's not available, it's just extremely fragmented. So it's spread across hundreds of thousands of sources in more than a dozen languages. So, to tackle that challenge, what we did was we assembled a team of 142 fact finders and financial analysts at William and Mary. And we basically just followed the money to every corner and every sector of the globe. I mean, we scoured financial statements, stock exchange filings, bond prospectuses, mortgage agreements, escrow account agreements, and collateral registries, you name it. And then after that, this 36-month investigation, ultimately what we did was centralize and standardize all of that fragmented information about China's cross-border lending operations into one single master database. So drawing from over 246,000 sources, we're sort of triangulating all this information into one master database. So it's quite an undertaking.
And I would just
It,
add, I would just add
yeah,
that really this process is quite tiring. There's a lot of research assistants and also honestly staff on team that speak different languages. We have staff that speak Spanish, that work on sort of the Latin American countries, right? Venezuela, for example, that only publish Spanish speaking sources. But also French for a lot of the Francophone countries, but also, honestly, Mandarin for a lot of the Chinese sources. And as you know, the translation issue is honestly one of the most critical problems that we face. So if you have a bunch of research assistants on the team that speak Mandarin fluently, then that issue sort of just goes away. So I think AidData is really well positioned to do this kind of research because we have really a great team of students and also staff that have these critical skills.
we should point out that folks who are tuning in right now, they're going to have questions, and we welcome those questions. So we're going to reserve about 15 minutes or so on the back end of this Q&A to hear from you all in a direct Q&A. So get some of those questions ready, and we'll be sure to get to them. But Sailor, as we hear from you now, you're an AidData researcher. You started this when you were a student at William and Mary. Can you walk us through a little bit of your path and how you ended up on this project?
Yeah, sure. So, I really, when I went to my high school in Alabama, it's completely random. I just sort of fell in love with the colonial vibes of Williamsburg on a high school trip, decided to attend college here. And during COVID, as a freshman in my dorm, I just accidentally heard about this small lab called AidData, right, from my roommate's laptop when he was having a class on Zoom. And I thought, well, I don't know how much I knew about the Belt and Road Initiative, but I speak Mandarin, so I just applied. So as a student researcher, I absolutely enjoy doing research. At first, the research I was doing honestly was quite simple, right? It's source gathering, source scraping, record writing, a lot of simple things. But eventually, I got more opportunities and I got more responsibilities. I was mentoring more junior students. I was writing part of the methodology, and eventually I got hired to be a staff member on the team. But I just vividly remember, as a freshman, talking to my first supervisor. His name is Sheng. He's still on the team. I just remember telling him, "Hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could work together as coworkers?" And here we are. We're coworkers. And then I just attended his wedding last year. It just a wonderful memory for me. I will say during my journey, William Mary is really an integral part of my success. Our international relations or government curriculum is challenging. There are just endless presentations and long essays for me to do, but it gives all of us great analytical skills, and the other colleges just simply don't offer. But I just also want to say a hearty thank you to the Global Research Institute for giving me so many opportunities for presenting my research as a student in front of hundreds of people at the China convening a couple of years ago, and attending a bunch of conferences and having a really cool internship at the UN. So thank you so much.
No, it must be cool to then see where we are in this moment and to see your work getting so much attention as it much deserves. Let's take a step back. Why pursue this? I mean, it's a big endeavor. As you mentioned, 142 plus people part of this, 3 years. It's a lot of work. Why focus on this topic in particular and tracking where China is putting its money?
Right. I would say that one big reason is because Chinese financing to the world is quite opaque, like Brad pointed out earlier. And a lot of times China, unlike OECD countries, right, some of the Western democracies, does not really disclose much of the information. It only occasionally discloses information in these white papers. So really, we don't understand what China does in terms of its official financing to developing countries, but more importantly, to developed countries, right, like the US, European Union. So we don't really have any knowledge on financing, on what China does, right? What China buys, what China loans, right? We don't have any ideas on the debt situation of the countries, and really even multilateral organizations like the International Monetary Funds don't have the complete picture of the information due to these confidentiality clauses that China has with these countries. So this is why AidData offers this kind of really unique research that sort of reveals the real nature of Chinese financing. If we're not doing this kind of research, I'm afraid there's nobody else that is doing it. And so we're really doing a great service, not only for all of the nerds out there, but we're also doing a great service for developing countries that are facing some debt crisis right now.
David, I would also just add one thing that really surprised us is that I think in our mind's eye, we think of China, many of us think of China as a strong, centralized, authoritarian state that has a perfect grasp on everything that it's doing, right? And I think one of the interesting things about our database is it shows there's actually a sprawling network of state-owned donors and lenders that are administering this overseas lending and grant giving program. There's over just about 1,200 of these government agencies and state-owned entities that are providing aid and credit. And so we've had multiple instances where the Chinese authorities have come to us and said, look, there is no master database that we control. We don't have full visibility on everything that's going on. There's a lot of decentralized activity. And so we've seen many instances in which Chinese line ministries, technocrats ask for permission to use our data because they don't possess the data themselves. So there's also, for just to be able to do sort of day-to-day decision making and analysis, there aren't only applications of the data and the analysis outside of China, right? It's also being used inside China.
I mean, it kind of pushes back on this idea of there's some grand plan at work or something, and they're across all aspects of it. You mentioned state owned, and I think it's an important part here because oftentimes when we're labeling, what one company is investing in another organization or country, it's specific to that company, right? But with China, we throw on the big label, China, and that's where the money is. How are you distinguishing that from, what folks might say, well, it's not really a Chinese state-owned entity. This is, this company, but we do know that there are aspects to these companies that obviously have ties to the party and to the government as a whole.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and the way that we've tried to approach this is with maximum transparency by letting the facts speak for themselves. So our sort of inclusion criterion for what goes in our database is that if the source of aid or credit is a government agency or a majority state-owned institution, then it's in the database. And so some of the activities that are being undertaken by, say, a Bank of China or a ICBC, these are state-owned commercial banks, some of the things that they're doing, let's say in the US, they're financing Tesla, they're financing General Motors, some of these things are not necessarily problematic. They are benign commercial transactions where, as banks, they're doing what banks do. They're looking for profitable ways to invest and make some money. At the same time, Beijing adopted this policy in May 2015 called Made in China 2025. And the basic idea with the policy was within 10 years, so by 2025, this year, we as the government want to see the country achieve self-sufficiency in 10 kind of industries of the future, stuff like robotics, semiconductors, biotechnology. And so as soon as they adopted that policy, they instrumentalized the banks. They basically said, okay, well, now we're going to use our banks to accomplish this policy objective. So if you're going to go and buy, if you want to become expert in semiconductors or in robotics, well, where do those assets exist? They don't exist in developing countries. They exist in developed countries. And so as Chinese companies on their own, they might be worried that it's too expensive or it's too risky to go and buy, let's say, a semiconductor company in the United Kingdom if it's going to cost $1 billion. But what if the state says, you know what, here's our credit card. Put it on state credit. We'll cover 70%, you cover 30%. Well, now maybe, that wasn't your top priority until the state came around and made it easier for you to participate in a commercial activity that advances the policy objectives of the state. And that's exactly what we see in our data. So there's a lot of transactions in the database that are aligned with state policy made in China 2025 and other state policy directives, but not all of the transactions are aligned with state policy. So it's a little bit like, being able to sift through all these transactions and figure out which ones are serving a geoeconomic strategy or a geopolitical strategy, and then which ones are just normal commercial transactions. There are no simple answers to that question, but you can't answer the questions in the absence of comprehensive and granular data. And that's sort of the vacuum, like the informational vacuum that we've tried to fill.
Right. I mean, and you're obviously putting that data out there and allowing kind of folks to attach to it what they will, but you're not putting that label out yourself. I mean, because I think when a lot of people read some of these headlines, there's an immediate thought of, oh, this is nefarious activity that's underway, right? This money is going and making the U.S. reliant on a country that it shouldn't be. And certainly that would be the rhetoric that we would see from a political perspective out of Washington, for example, towards Beijing. But the realities, as you all have found, and Sailor, I'm curious about these transactions specific to the United States, really show that the relationship, certainly economically, is far more intertwined. And we've known this, but I mean, we know it really from when a China perspective of investment comes around. It's always Belt and Road Initiative, right? It's always developing countries. I think what you all have pushed back is now this high income country aspect that's benefiting from it, quite frankly, from a lending perspective. Sailor, with those transactions that you all were following, any within the U.S. that stand out to you?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think like Brett says, there are definitely sort of two tranches of money. One tranche goes to sort of some of the sensitive sectors that we all know about, some of the more interesting ones, right? Semiconductor, biotechnology, defense technology that everybody feels nervous about. But a lot of money actually goes to sort of the more benign commercial factors. We're talking about just regular corporate loans. And what I mean by that is these big Fortune 500 companies like Disney, Tesla, Apple, you name it, every company that you can think of, they need big amount of money. So they borrow money from international banks like Citibank, American banks, Japanese banks, European banks, and also Chinese banks. It just so happens that Chinese banks, most of them are just state-owned. So it's the same way Chinese banks participate in group lending called syndication. So basically they lend a large amount of money to these Fortune 500 companies to the US. I would say that amount is probably benign because it doesn't really have any sensitive factors. It really just about the transaction of money where the Fortune 500 companies pay back the money. There's nothing else. But what's really interesting about the other tranche is sort of the transaction of perhaps technology, right? If a Chinese bank is lending the money to a Chinese company, and the Chinese company in turn then acquire a American company for the acquisition of a critical technology, then that's something more interesting, right? And just thinking about a local example, Smithfield, probably for folks in Virginia, if you've eaten bacon in the last week or so from grocery store, that's probably from Smithfield. I mean, I certainly did it. And I will have you know that Smithfield is actually bought by a Chinese company called Shuanghui. It's actually the money, it came from a bunch of Chinese loans. It's really in the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, really. And it's that kind of thing. And you would think, okay, Smithfield is only a meat processing company. That wouldn't be sensitive, would it? Would it? But when you think about it, it's food security, it's agriculture product. When it comes to that kind of industry, right? If you have a rival or adversary or a competitor, however you define China at this point, if you have a competitor controlling a critical sector like agriculture, should you be concerned? So that's definitely a good question for DC, Washington folks to think about.
David, I would also just add that, the analogy that I use when trying to describe the challenge that US regulators face is the idea of searching for a needle in a haystack. So there's thousands of these transactions in the US. Most of them are benign, but then you see some cases where there are real national security risks. There was one egregious case in which an insurance company was purchased offshore in the Cayman Islands. It's called Ironshore Inc. And it just turned out that that insurance company that was purchased with Chinese loans owned a US subsidiary. And the US subsidiary sold insurance not just to anyone, they sold professional liability insurance to CIA and FBI officials, right? And so because the money was routed offshore, it was outside the regulatory reach of the US Treasury. The US Treasury is charged with screening inbound sources of foreign capital that present national security risks. They missed this particular case. The acquisition sailed through and was very embarrassing. And then after the fact, they basically went back to Congress and said, we need more power. We need more authority to prevent something like this from happening. There was a forced divestiture in order to ensure, the big concern was if a Chinese company purchases this insurance company, that they have access to all the names and addresses and personally identifiable information about national security officials in the US. So you can see how something that's seemingly benign, seemingly innocuous, buying an insurance company, and actually the company wasn't even in the US. It was headquartered in Bermuda, right? And then there's these complexities where, oh, but there's also, you know, a subsidiary in Delaware, and it turns out one of their biggest customers is the US government. So that just gives you a sense of the challenge that regulators are up against. It is not as though these problematic transactions advertise themselves. They don't come through the front door and wave their hands and say, I'm a problematic transaction. You got to really search for it. And so there's this global game of cat and mouse that is now underway where the Chinese, both creditors and companies, they know they're facing higher levels of scrutiny than ever before. So they're getting more creative, right? They're routing money offshore. They're running through these international bank syndicates to sort of keep a lower profile. It's like a fly beneath the radar strategy. So, you know, even if there's one problematic transaction for every 20 or 50 benign transactions, that does not make the challenge any less difficult. And in some ways, it makes the challenge more difficult for regulators, right? Because you're just, you know, you're up against such a heavy volume, and it's not a heavy volume of transactions, and it's just not self-evident when these transactions present real risks.
And Brad, I feel like, I mean, because this hasn't been out there before, and you guys are putting a lot of this information public for the first time, I mean, are you, or do you expect to have US lawmakers reaching out to comb through some of this data? Have you heard anything so far to that effect?
Yeah, there's no question that Congress will pay close attention to this. Agencies in the US Treasury and other federal agencies, I am certain, they've used our data heavily in the past. I'm sure they will use it heavily in the future. You know, one thing that's interesting is that there's two types of investment coming into the US. One is called brownfield and one is called greenfield. So brownfield is when you're buying an existing asset. And greenfield is when you're building a new asset, like we're building a power plant from scratch or a data center from scratch. The US Treasury only has legal authority to regulate inbound foreign capital for brownfield, for existing assets, not for new ones. So there's power plants in Ohio, and there's you know, oil and gas terminals in Louisiana and Texas that are all on the greenfield side, and they are completely outside the regulatory reach of the US government. So I think our data will raise questions about whether any of those investments merit greater scrutiny. But more generally, I think there's just very limited. We have heard from US government officials that they don't have full visibility on the full range of lending activities. And sometimes they will know that a Chinese company purchased an asset. For example, in Michigan, there's a company called the Paslin Company, a robotics firm that was purchased. They knew it was purchased. They did not know it was purchased with state credit, right? So China Exim Bank, a policy bank, not a deposit-taking bank. This is a bank that is a slave to the government. Like they call it a policy bank because you're executing the policy objectives of the government. They subsidize the acquisition of this robotics company. And so it's things like that, the hidden hand of the party state guiding Chinese companies, that is harder for them to observe. And that's where I think this type of data and evidence adds value.
Is there an argument to be made here that, I mean, obviously folks have concerns, right, when they see the money coming from Chinese companies in particular, and perhaps with ties to the government. But is there an argument to be made that if that funding were to be pulled, certainly in the numbers that we're seeing with the US, you know, receiving the most of it so far, if you pull that, does it potentially then lead to collapse for some of these companies and you know, trouble in certain industries within the US? I mean, is this critical funding?
I mean, I don't think it's you know, going to make or break a lot of these firms. But on the other hand, I would say, given that a large percentage of the funding coming into the US is benign, there is a real risk of regulatory overreach, that you overdo it, right? And you push all sources of Chinese credit out when they're meeting the liquidity needs of U.S. corporations at no risk or at minimal risk, right? So, there's not all of this lending serves some sort of grand geopolitical design. Some of it just has very narrow commercial aims where, the purpose of the lending operation is the pursuit of profit, not the pursuit of sort of geostrategic advantage.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder if some of this comes to light and if it's news not only for US lawmakers, if some in China are going to look at this and say, well, why are we allowing that funding to take place as well? I mean, I guess it could go both ways in that sense.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there's very little transparency about the vast reach of China's overseas lending and grant giving portfolio within the jurisdictional boundaries of mainland China. And I know that when news has spilled out about these cross-border aid and credit activities, it has elicited a lot of pushback, especially in poorer provinces or provinces with high levels of unemployment. We've seen in the past that they've said, wait a second, we're spending what? Where? For what purpose? We still have needs here at home. So in some ways, China is no different than other great powers that are providing aid and credit. We've faced similar problems in the US where taxpayers are saying, look, we have scarce resources and we need to make trade-offs between domestic needs and international objectives.
Sailor, I think you gave a great example with Smithfield, and not only timely, given a lot of people will have ham on the table for Thanksgiving, but it's one of the things I always go into stories asking is why should people care about this, right? And when you look at something that's so big, that seems to involve so many different, it's multifaceted across several different countries, several different organizations. When you kind of catch your breath with all this data that's out there, and you want to bring it home to somebody here in the US, how do you sell it in saying, here's why you should care?
Right. I would say, again, I think like Brad really summarized really well. Even when our data, a lot of information really shows how interconnected China and the US are, just because of the sheer amount of money that China state-owned actors have pumped into the U.S. economy, be it benign loans or other really sensitive sector loans, right? There's really money that are going into interesting companies that perhaps the U.S. lawmakers should pay attention to, and like Brad shown in a few examples. So even though probably folks that don't really pay attention to news probably don't really know about these cases, but just us Americans or us regular people, if you want to maintain your way of life, you probably should pay more attention to this kind of things. We're just doing our little job, and we're a data-driven lab. We are not partisan. We are not biased. We do not, form our opinions before we have our data. We always collect our data before we have our opinions. So you can have that as our guarantee.
David, if I could just add, one reason why I think Americans should care about this is because this isn't just a story about what China's doing. The next chapter of this story is about how the US and its allies are going to respond. So the name of the report is Chasing China, Learning to Play by Beijing's Global Lending Rules. And the reason why we titled the report the way we did is because we're really at kind of a pivot point in how the US conducts foreign policy, and specifically how it's going to try to win this geostrategic competition with China. So, when I first started doing this back in tracking China's overseas lending and grant giving activities in 2013, I'll be honest with you, like Beijing's approach, its approach to lending, international lending and grant giving, it was really like a source of scorn or ridicule in Washington and London and Brussels. And now it's just turned upside down. Like that is no longer the case. Now the US and its allies, they are increasingly focused on competing with China via emulation rather than differentiation. So the mantra of Washington and the group of seven, all the countries that are in the G7, the new mantra seems to be whatever you can do, I can do better. So like they used to voluntarily tie their own hands and they said, look, we're going to limit the provision of aid and credit to countries with the greatest economic needs. We're only going to provide aid and credit to low income and middle income countries. Well, now what are they doing? There's legislation that's being considered on the Hill right now where essentially the US and its allies are saying, we're taking the gloves off. Like now we want to loosen the restrictions that prevent our international lending and grant giving institutions so that they can support projects and activities in high income countries and wealthy industrialized countries, just like China, right? What else are they doing? They're fast tracking projects with national security justifications. They're trying to take ownership stakes in critical infrastructure assets overseas, critical mineral assets overseas. And what are they doing at the same time? We just shut down USAID, right? So they're shuttering foreign aid agencies and slashing the budgets of foreign aid institutions more generally that focus on the needs of low-income countries. And I think that merits some scrutiny and debate in the US. Like this is how we're now going to reallocate US taxpayer dollars instead of directing aid and credit to developing countries, we're going to redirect it to developed countries. And I just think that debate has not really happened yet. And you can't really have the debate unless the data and evidence is out there in the public domain to say, this is what China's doing. Do we want to compete with them by differentiating ourselves, or do we just want to compete with them via mimicry or emulation?
But Brad, what does this research do, if anything, diplomatically? I mean, that is to say, obviously, relations with China can be complicated at times. Tariffs have added another factor to a lot of that. There's a lot of volatility within, the administration trying to deal with other countries as a whole. But I mean, between the U.S. and China, and then perhaps just globally, what, if any, impact do you think this research have?
Well, I think when you shine a very bright light on a lending portfolio and a grant giving portfolio that has secretive elements, and to be clear, there are segments of this portfolio that China does not want to spill into public view, right? And so I think that is going to force some difficult conversations, right? Because especially when China is lending in sensitive sectors, defense production, semiconductors, robotics, AI, it's not always obvious that the state is working behind the scenes, steering and subsidizing and scaling and sustaining the operations of Chinese companies. When that is rendered visible, it's sort of the hidden hand of the party state. When now the party state's hand is visible, there's nowhere to hide, and a conversation needs to take place, a diplomatic conversation about whether those activities are acceptable. And then within the US, I think it's going to instigate introspection about how involved the government should be in the economy, right? This is already happening under the Trump administration. They're taking, equity stakes in NVIDIA, and we're seeing impulse to try to increase the state's role in the economy. Well, that's exactly how the Chinese state works, right? And so again, I think there's just an important public discussion that needs to happen about how much power do we want to give the government to intervene in the economy? Is this a net positive or a net negative in terms of our long-run competitiveness, national competitiveness vis-a-vis China?
And I mean, I think there's a more neutral perspective to this, right? Like when you think about it, like Brad says, Washington and also these European powers are sort of learning from China's industrial policy and slashing USAID, slashing grant funding for developing countries. I mean, essentially, this is them tacitly acknowledging that the Chinese system, the way that it's giving these non-concessional, in other words, non-good loans to these countries, it kind of works, right? So and the way that China does industrial policy in the last couple of decades, right? In the Made in China 2025 used to be a source of mockery by Western countries in the U.S. and in the Belt and Road Initiative. But guess what? People, Washington and European Union, they're learning from China. So I guess if you're seeing from that perspective, our report could be seen from as sort of a praise on China's industrial policy.
And people are obviously going to be learning from this report too, Sailor. And having just spent an hour on a call before this with our internal folks at CNN for another story on exorcisms, totally different, but we go through a triad process, which is legal, standards, editorial. When it comes to this research, talk me through, because folks are obviously going to want to question things and be skeptical of certain aspects of it. What's the fact checking process? What's the refining to make sure each and every aspect that you're putting out holds sound?
I could jump in, and Sailor, if you want to also piggyback here. I mean, one thing that is very important to us is that we want our work to be above reproach. And the way that we do that is by making all of the data and the methods and the sources public. So we just published, I think, a 220-page manual that says these are the precise protocols that we followed to construct this database. And so the sort of methodological North Star is to ensure that our methodology is transparent, that it's systematic, and that it's replicable, meaning anyone could take that 220-page manual, follow the same procedures that we followed, and reproduce what we produced, right? So that's number one. Number two is AidData is not a think tank. We're based at a research university, and therefore we hold ourselves to the expectation that our work has to go through peer review. So over the last 13 years, we have subjected the data and the methods to multiple rounds of scientific peer review. And then based on the feedback that we receive, we've refined the ways in which we collect data and measure different variables. And then the other thing is that every single one of the primary sources, so there's more than 246,000 primary sources that underpin the 30,000 records in the database, we put them all in the cloud. We have a stable URL to these sources, and we make it all public. So at 1 a.m. this morning, we put it all in the public domain. So it's fully traceable. That way, if we made a mistake, an error of omission or an error of commission, this is not a trust me situation. Like, trust me, we're the experts. We've got it all figured out. If we made a mistake, we make it easy for people to spot those mistakes and bring it to our attention so that we can quickly correct the record.
All right, let's shift over to some of the folks in the chat, because there's a lot of questions around this, rightfully so. Hari writes, "Hey Brad, amazing work at AidData. I was just hoping to ask your take on what the grand strategy here is, the notion of lending to high-income countries. While narratives of debt sustainability and transparency often surrounded lending to low-income countries, I was just hoping to get to know your take on why this sudden increase in lending to high-income countries. What do you think?"
Just two quick things. One, I would say flight to safety. So when China first started lending, it started with high risk, high reward jurisdictions, right? So it was lending to developing countries where it stood to potentially make a lot of money, but it was also kind of going into very risky places where it could lose its shirt. And it did lose its shirt. And so it got overextended in the developing world. A lot of its borrowers were illiquid or insolvent and couldn't repay their debts. And so there's a rational reallocation of credit where the banks are saying, well, I don't want to lend to deadbeats. I could lend, to an illiquid or insolvent government in the developing world, or I could lend to Disney, right? Like some Fortune 500 company.
Wasn't that part of the allure that there would be a debt traps, for some of these countries, and that would then be acquired, as it's been argued, in some ports for China?
Yeah, I mean that was the claim, and
Right.
we've repeatedly debunked this claim. Like one of the virtues of putting all the primary sources in the public domain is that they allow us to subject some of the big hypotheses to empirical scrutiny, one of which was they're collateralizing these debts on physical illiquid assets like a seaport or an electricity grid. So they ensnare you and subordinate you, and then eventually seize these strategic assets. Well, it turns out when we started publishing all the unredacted loan contracts, we figured out that they're much smarter than that. They don't want to try to liquidate an illiquid asset in a foreign jurisdiction. That is a nightmare. They collateralize on cash. They ask their borrowers to put large amounts of dollars and euros in offshore bank accounts that they can unilaterally debit with a keystroke on their computer in the event that their borrowers miss a payment. So again, there's just like a lot of mythology around Chinese lending, and you really can't puncture the myths unless you have these high value primary sources where you can see in black and white text, this is what the borrowers and the creditors agreed to. But to get back to the question, there's a flight to safety. There's more solvent, more liquid borrowers in wealthy industrialized countries. So there's a very benign explanation for why they're moving to the wealthy industrialized world. But then we have to hold two sort of seemingly contradictory ideas in our head at the same time. That is true. On the other hand, this Made in China 2025 policy was very much directed towards high-income countries, because if you want to win the future, if you want to seize the technologies of the future, you need to go where they're located. And guess where they're located? In high-income countries.
Anonymous attendee writes this: how's the current U.S. administration responding to this data? Have they responded?
It's too soon to say. I mean, we put it out into the world at 1 a.m. this morning, so we're waiting. I'm sure we will be hearing from different parts of the government, but something that we're keeping a very, very close eye on is that there's one particular U.S. government institution called the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, and they have pending legislation to reauthorize, to basically give them 7 more years of runway as a government agency that may potentially give them new authorities, one of which would be to operate in high-income countries. So this whole thing of chasing China, emulating China, mimicking China it is front and center. There's a debate happening right now among legislators to say, is this what we want to do? They have a $60 billion cap on essentially their lending operations, and the Congress is looking at maybe lifting that to 250 billion. And this agency was essentially created to help the U.S. Compete with China. So I very much anticipate that folks on the Hill will be taking a close look at this report to say, okay, before we reauthorize DFC, let's have a clear-eyed assessment of the challenge that we're up against.
Yong writes this in the chat, and this is actually a question that came to my mind as well. Not sure if I understand you correctly. Do you mean that China is silently dropping its one belt, one road policy? Are you seeing BRI being eliminated here, essentially?
No, it's just been much smaller as a proportion of the overall portfolio than we previously thought it was. Because a lot of this lending to high-income countries that's more related to supporting Fortune 500 companies or acquiring high-tech assets, that stuff was not tracked anywhere. It wasn't measured anywhere. And therefore, we were it was the streetlight effect, right? The streetlight effect is what you know is a function of where you shine the light. So previously, the light was being shined on the most visible things, which are these physical infrastructure projects that are out in the world that people are reporting on and
Which word to, I was
experiencing.
gonna say, which word to blame for that? I mean, what
Yeah,
we see,
everybody,
yeah,
researchers, media, there's a lot of blame to go around
yeah.
in terms of sort of slurring the distinction between Belt and Road and China's overseas lending. Like everyone basically said these are one and the same. And this was just a function of no one thinking it was there, that you needed to look under the couch cushions and try to figure out, are they actually, most people just assume they're not engaging in high income countries. Well, they're not only engaging in high income countries, it's 50% of the portfolio. It's $1 trillion, right? So yeah, it's not that Belt and Road is out or that they're no longer interested in it. It just never constituted the lion's share of the lending portfolio in the first place.
One of these questions here gets pretty detailed, but I want to get to it before we end because again, another anonymous attendee. Does the data include coverage on financing clean tech, greenfield manufacturing, for example, BYD's investment in Hungary or Goshen's investment in Michigan?
It absolutely does. Yes. So there is a variable in the data set that allows you to say, is this a loan for foreign direct investment? Yes or no. And then you can differentiate between, is it a foreign direct investment loan for greenfield or for brownfield? And then even going one level deeper, you can look at sector and subsector analysis. So, is it supporting a battery factory in Hungary or, a solar power plant? So yeah, all of that. The database is sector agnostic. So it covers all sectors, including all subsectors within the power sector.
Seth asks, speaking of the cash loan collaterals, these loans are typically denominated in USD or euros. Given the size of this loan portfolio, does this leverage open up the possibility of changing what have been called reserve or hard currencies?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I totally understand that one. Maybe the commenter could contact me separately and elaborate, or turn the volume on and reiterate. But yeah, I didn't quite grasp it.
All right. Well, I mean, and that's a good point because I think folks are going to have a lot of follow-up too. So if and I know we have the more on AidData there, and I assume contact information is there for both of you as well, if there's a desire to,
Yes.
because I think people are going to want to get into a lot of detail that we just simply won't have time for. I mean, it took you all 3 years to put this together. So, in an hour Zoom, it may not be possible. Have you found overlaps between China and international institutions, e.g. the World Bank, IFC, IDB, IMF, development banks?
I mean, the Sailor can jump in here, but one of the striking findings in this report is that China's moving away from bilateral lending, meaning one lender, one Chinese lender, one borrower. They are heavily pivoting into so-called syndicated lending, where they participate in a syndicate, a group of lenders. And the interesting thing that we found is these syndicates are very heterogeneous, meaning it's not uncommon at all for there to be American banks in the syndicates, for there to be British and European and other Asian banks that are participating. And so, yeah, that's a feature rather than a bug of the way that they now conduct their overseas operations, and they have multiple motivations for running through syndicates. Some of which are completely benign, some of which are less benign. So it's a great, if you want to keep a low profile, like fly beneath the radar, one way to do it is through a syndicate. And we see that with some of these sensitive acquisition loans where you're going in to buy a high-tech company. At the same time, syndicates are also a normal, it's a standard market practice, right? And so if you're just looking to make profit, you might say, look, rather than being exposed to all of the risk with this loan, it's $1 billion loan. I don't want to be exposed to 100% of the risk. So I'll just, my ticket share, the percentage of the loan, I'll just take 10%. So if it's $1 billion loan, the Chinese bank might say, JP Morgan, you organize the loan, or Bank of America, you organize it. I'll come in after you've found a good borrower, found a good project, ensured they're liquid, ensured they're solvent, and then I'll just chip in $100 million at the end. So it's sort of like outsourcing due diligence, right, to other banks. So it's not as though Chinese lending is an exclusively Chinese undertaking, right? It's increasingly sort of globalized or internationalized.
Which I think would surprise a lot of folks too. Sailor, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that there's a lot of syndication between Chinese banks and also international multilaterals, specifically to developing countries, right? There are these Chinese banks, corporations with regional banks like African Development Banks and also the Asian Development Bank, right? These are regional multilaterals. They cooperate together, and like Brett said, they sort of Chinese banks adhere to these regional multilaterals environmental standards, and they do projects together in these regional countries, right? Like we're talking about Cambodia, we're talking about Djibouti in Africa or Asia, and they do infrastructure projects together. But I will say those projects specifically, the numbers are quite small. If we're only talking about infrastructure projects, China probably most of them China does it alone.
We've got about a minute left, but I want to ask this question and then wrap up here. But Kenneth has a great one. What is the flip side of your fantastic study? The extent of U.S. lending to all kinds of bodies in China. Does money go the other way?
Such a great question. The short answer is we don't know. And frankly, we should not have to mount a similarly ambitious and complex data collection operation or investigation to answer that. China considers this information to be very, very sensitive. We've not looked into that. We've not launched a similar investigation, but hopefully, there will be sufficient transparency to provide answers about outbound flows, financial flows from the US to China or other parts of the world. And I think that's one of the big questions facing the Congress right now in looking at this reauthorization bill of the DFC. If we are going to start lending in ways that are more analogous to China, are we going to do it with maximum transparency, or are we going to go into dark mode and do this in the shadows?
You've got 3 years to start digging right now. Let's
exactly. I've got 142 fact finders and financial analysts. We could redirect them at the US if need be.
They're ready. I'm just curious, just finally here, what's next for AidData?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we're going to be taking a close look at going forward is how these loans are performing, financially performing. Like how many of the loans are leading to China being repaid? How much exposure do they have to bad debts? When they have to bail out a borrower in financial distress and try to restore them to financial health, how do they go about doing that? So Sailor's involved in a loan performance team that's really focused on sort of understanding the Chinese way of dealing with bad debts, distressed debt.
Fascinating. All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for letting me be part of this conversation with you both. And incredible work to you and the other 140 individuals who were involved in this incredible project. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.